how can a collection of ancient texts, written across millennia by different people, different cultures, how can they still have such a powerful, sometimes really unsettling influence on how we think about, well, everything? Politics, philosophy, violence, even reality itself.
It's a huge question, isn't it? And it goes beyond just religious belief.
Exactly. It's about the sheer weight, the kind of undeniable presence of the Bible as this foundational document shaping Western civilization.
Right. And how have thinkers, really sharp minds, wrestled with that power?
Right.
With its complexities, its contradictions, its impact.
Yeah, that question gets right to the heart of why these texts, why they still feel so relevant.
Because their influence isn't just locked away in churches or synagogues, right?
They're
woven into the very fabric of our language, our laws, our moral frameworks, even our political imagination. It's a presence we kind of feel, even if we don't fully understand where it comes from.
Totally. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
So glad to be here.
We're exploring excerpts from John Ranieri's book, Disturbing Revelation, Leo Strauss, Eric Voegelin, and the Bible. And this book, it takes a really fascinating look at how three intellectual heavyweights, Leo Strauss, Eric Voegelin, and René Girard, approach the Bible. Not primarily as, a text for faith necessarily,
right,
but as this critical, sometimes deeply, deeply disturbing source text for understanding Western thought.
And that's a crucial distinction Ranieri makes right up front. This isn't about, say, a theological debate in a church setting.
No.
Our mission here is to understand how these thinkers, coming from really different philosophical places, how they read the Bible, how they interpreted its narrative, its legacy.
How they saw its impact on philosophy, on politics, on the modern world, basically.
Yeah. Did they see it as mainly a source of order or maybe disorder?
Or wisdom, or potentially, dangerous idealism.
And the violence question is huge. Did it justify violence for them? Or, like Girard argues so radically, did it offer this profound revelation against violence?
So we're going to unpack their perspectives, which often clash, actually. We want to cut through some of the density, find the key insights. And you might be listening and thinking, okay, why does this matter to me today?
It's a fair question. These are old texts, complex thinkers.
Right. But if you've ever wondered about the hidden roots of our Western ideas, like why do we think the way we do about society, about justice, conflict, authority, progress even, or victimhood, then understanding how these foundational texts and these powerful interpretations of them have shaped that whole landscape. Well, it's vital. It helps you see the patterns, the paradoxes still playing out all around us.
It's about seeing that our present isn't cut off from this ancient past. It's shaped by these ongoing conversations with it, even when we don't realize it.
Okay, let's unpack this. So Ranieri starts by painting the broad picture. When he talks about the Bible in this book, he means the whole collection, the Jewish Bible and the Christian New Testament.
Right, the whole suite.
And he's up front. The point isn't really religious belief per se. It's about recognizing the undeniable formative effect this collection has had on Western civilization.
It's like you can't understand the architecture of a city without looking at its bedrock, right? Its foundational buildings, even if you never go inside them.
That's a good analogy.
The Bible's cultural influence, it just permeates everything. Our legal ideas, literature, art, and especially political language. It goes way beyond religious boundaries.
And okay, it was written over such a long time, different people, different contexts.
Yeah.
But Ranieri argues there's still a fundamental continuity.
Yeah, he thinks you can legitimately talk about a biblical teaching or a biblical message. Despite the diversity, there's a common thread.
So what's the core narrative he pulls out?
Well, the basics are belief in a good creator God who's active in history, working towards salvation and fulfillment for humanity.
Okay.
And this plan unfolds through specific events. Think the liberation of Israel from Egypt, the covenant, the law, the call to be a witness, a light to the nations.
And then the prophets.
Right, the prophets reminding Israel of its responsibilities, warning of disaster, but also offering these visions of redemption. And the sages reflecting on the human condition, offering wisdom.
And for Christians, obviously, the New Testament sees this hope culminating in Jesus, his life, death, resurrection, forming a new community, spreading the gospel. So the thematic core running through all this is creation, redemption, and community.
Exactly. They're distinct ideas, sure, but you can rarely separate them in the text. The God who redeems is the God who creates, and the one calling people into community. It's all intertwined.
And Ranieri points out something really interesting about the order of experience for the biblical peoples. It wasn't like philosophy first, then experience.
No, it was the other way around. It was redemption first. They experienced being saved by God first. That was primary.
Oh, right.
And because of that experience, they formed covenants, fellowships, and then within that context of community and worship, they reflected on the goodness of creation and God's actions.
So that experience of salvation, that confidence in God's faithfulness, that's what fuels their hope for the future, looking towards a time when God's sovereignty reigns.
Precisely. And that gives a lot of these texts a deeply eschatological character. History isn't random. It's seen as purposefully directed towards a final goal by God.
Like Paul Hansen's point about history being directed.
Yes. And symbols like the kingdom of God or the age to come, they aren't just about some faraway heaven.
Right.
They represent a divine order that's actually breaking into the present imperfect world. It's this dynamic of divine initiative and human response aimed at a future that's both already present and not yet fully realized.
And that not yet dimension, it has huge political implications, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Think about the Exodus story. Michael Walzer argues it's basically the original blueprint for a really characteristic Western pattern of political change.
What pattern is that?
Oppression, liberation, forming a new social contract, political struggle, striving for a new society, and then the danger of falling back, restoration.
Wow. He sees that whole cycle originating there.
He does. He argues this pattern isn't universal, but it belongs particularly to Jews and Christians in the West. It's etched really deeply into our political culture, our political language.
So we still frame things that way.
Often unconsciously, yeah. Complaining about oppression, hoping for deliverance, joining movements like covenants, aiming for a promised land of a better society. Walzer says that's the Exodus pattern playing out. It's the language we reach for.
Beyond that specific template, Ranieri also highlights how the Bible shows this deep wariness, maybe, towards attempts to divinize state power or the social order.
Definitely. Look at founding myths. In Genesis, Cain founds the first city, right? But he's shown as a murderer, and his deed is not excused or glorified.
Okay, contrast that with.
Well, compare it to Romulus killing Remus to found Rome. That violence is often framed as, necessary, justified for the city's birth.
Right, or the Exodus itself.
Exactly. It's a departure from Egypt, a civilization built on the pharaoh's supposed divinity. It's a rejection of that model.
And wasn't there resistance to having a king in Israel?
Yes, a strong resistance initially. Fearing they'd become like other nations, lose their direct relationship with God, give too much power to a human ruler.
And the prophets were constantly challenging the powerful, weren't they? Kings, priests, the wealthy.
Constantly, calling them out for injustice, for exploiting the poor, the vulnerable. Think Isaiah, Amos, Micah. They don't hold back.
And Jesus' attitude towards political authority, it seems quite detached, almost indifferent at times. Render to Caesar.
That attitude seems to have passed to the early Christian communities. Sheldon Wolin points out they saw themselves as fundamentally outside the political order.
Like they already belonged to a different society.
A pure, higher purpose society, yeah. Pitched to a transcendent key, as Wolin puts it, they created this new form of community alongside the existing political structures, which was a pretty radical challenge in itself.
So this whole biblical narrative, it implies a certain way of life focused on righteousness, compassion, justice.
Absolutely. Micah's famous summary captures it well. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. That's presented as the core expectation.
And Ranieri points to this consistent thread, this prominent trajectory. The Bible siding with the victim.
Yeah, he acknowledges there's violence in the Bible, sometimes attributed to God or commanded by God. You can't ignore that.
Right.
But Chiti, he argues, the overwhelming direction, the main thrust of the narrative, is towards identifying with those who suffer unjustly.
Examples.
Well, the liberation from slavery in Egypt is the big one. The prophets constantly denouncing the mistreatment of the poor, the widow, the orphan. The Psalms full of cries from the unjustly suffering, Job asserting his innocence as a victim.
And in the New Testament.
The ultimate example for Christians. The identification of God himself with the suffering victim in the Passion accounts. Ranieri sees these texts as exemplary, reflecting the core salvation message.
And this is where René Girard comes in later, right? This concern for victims.
Exactly. For Girard, this biblical siding with the victim is the absolute center, the core of modern Western moral thinking. It's what shapes our conscience, often without us realizing its roots.
So when Ranieri talks about the biblical, he's not talking about one monolithic thing, but there's this real common thread woven through it all.
Yeah, a commonality and continuity of vision, he argues. It creates this unique perspective that has just profoundly shaped the West, giving us templates for political change, weariness of absolute state power, and this deep-seated ethical concern for victims.
It's like a foundational set of ideas that still structures our world, whether we recognize it or not.
Pretty much, yeah. It's the water we swim in, culturally speaking. Micro-recon.
Okay, let's just quickly recap that first section. We've laid out how Ranieri sees the Bible not primarily religious, but as this incredibly formative cultural text for the West.
Right. We talked about its core narrative structure, creation, redemption, community, and how redemption was often the first experience for biblical peoples.
And that fuels this eschatological hope, this sense of history moving towards a goal, the kingdom of God being both present and not yet.
Then we hit the political implications. Walser's idea of the Exodus story as this key Western blueprint for political change.
Oppression, liberation, covenant, new society.
Exactly. And alongside that, this deep biblical wariness of divinizing the state or social order, contrasting Cain with Romulus, resisting monarchy, the prophetic critiques.
And finally, that really strong trajectory Ranieri points out. The Bible siding with the victim, which Girard later picks up as absolutely central to Western morality.
Yeah, so even before we get into Strauss, Voegelin, and Girard's specific takes, Ranieri establishes the Bible itself as this powerful, complex, culture-shaping force with these key patterns and principles embedded within it.
Got it. A really important foundation to lay. Yeah. Okay, so we have this foundational text. Now, how do Strauss and Voegelin actually approach it? They start by asking, how do you even read something this old, this complex, this influential?
Right. What does it mean to understand its origins, or its truth claims, or its meaning today?
And Leo Strauss, as a historian of thought, he had a very specific method, didn't he?
Extremely specific. His core principle was understand the thought of the past exactly as it understood itself. For him, if you start imposing your own ideas, you're abandoning objectivity.
So it's all about the author's original intent, getting back to what they meant.
That's the goal. He knew, of course, that texts get reinterpreted over time. We read the Bible differently now than people did centuries ago. That's obvious. But Strauss insisted the author understood the text in one way only. So true interpretation for him is about recovering that original meaning, making it intelligible again.
What about all the other interpretations then?
He tended to view them a bit skeptically as maybe coming from trying to understand the author better than they understood themselves, which he thought was problematic.
Ranieri brings in Joseph Ratzinger here, though. Pope Benedict XVI.
Yeah, with a slight nuance. Ratzinger kind of agrees, but adds that really weighty human utterances, especially those that mature within a living faith community.
Like the Bible.
Exactly. They can contain more meaning than the author was maybe immediately conscious of. There's a deeper value that transcends the moment, because the author isn't just speaking as a private individual, but within this larger historical movement, maybe guided by something greater.
Interesting tension there. But Strauss's method itself,
Yeah.
how did he actually read?
Meticulously, he'd ask. What's the subject matter, as the author designated it? What was their intention? What questions were they trying to answer? What aspects were they most concerned with?
Only after figuring that out.
Only then could you start collecting statements on specific topics and know what was really significant or central. And he warned against assuming the most fundamental teaching is necessarily the clearest one, or the one repeated most often. You have to look deeper, maybe for subtle hints or hidden arguments.
And for Strauss, this whole quest for original meaning, it becomes especially urgent because of.
Yes. Nietzsche, for Strauss, fundamentally shook the foundations of tradition. Its self-evident truth just collapsed. We're left in this world without clear authority or direction.
So the ancient question, pas biotion, how are we to live, suddenly has real teeth again.
Exactly. Strauss felt that now, after Nietzsche, we can finally pose that question in earnest, free from the weight of unquestioned tradition.
But how do we answer it? We're still tangled up in tradition.
Strauss's answer: we have to rise to the origin of the tradition, get back to a state of natural ignorance, where genuinely free inquiry is possible again.
So tradition becomes completely questionable.
Utterly questionable. You can't just read the Bible and accept the prophet's word anymore. You have to seriously entertain the possibility, for instance, that the kings were right against the prophets. You have to start from the very beginning treating it as alien.
Okay, wow. And he connects this kind of radical questioning to something he calls the science of all cultures.
Yeah, he's a bit critical here. He sees this modern academic approach, studying all cultures with supposed neutrality, as actually fostering a specific moral posture.
Oh, cheers.
Openness to all cultures, universal tolerance, this kind of exhilaration from diversity.
That sounds good.
Well, Strauss argues it's a subtle shift from valuing your own particular tradition to valuing the universal idea of all cultures equally. And that's not neutral, he says. Pluralism itself becomes a kind of monism, the monism of universal tolerance. It implicitly asserts its own rightness over particular traditions.
Interesting critique. Now, Eric Voegelin,
Yeah.
he also looks at the Bible's formation, but sees a different kind of problem, right? Not just about reading intent.
Right. Voegelin finds evidence of a different kind of issue, may be related to that shift Strauss critiques. He argues that the divine word of the canonical Torah, the text we have, isn't quite the same as the original word of God revealed through the prophets. He sees the canonical Torah as potentially a deformation of the prophet's more immediate, pneumatic, spirit-filled word. He thinks it was shaped, maybe rigidified, by post-exilic editors and creators.
A deformation. The strong language. Is this part of his idea of egophanic deformation?
Exactly. That's his term for when living symbols that capture genuine experiences like wisdom or the word of God or the soul's pull towards the divine get turned into hardened, abstract systems. Think Hegel's logic as an extreme example.
And that leads to problems.
Big problems for Voegelin. It leads to ideological conflicts, dogmatism. You lose the original living insight, the connection to the actual experience.
So for Voegelin, the challenge isn't just reading the author's intent carefully.
No. It's about trying to get back from these hardened symbols, these doctrines, to the original experiences that gave them meaning in the first place.
And then what's blocking that return?
He talks about this massive block of accumulated secondary, tertiary symbols, interpretations, piled on interpretations, that kind of eclipses the reality of our existence in the metaxy.
The metaxy. Okay, that's a key Voegelin term. Remind us what that is.
It's the in-between, the realm of human existence. We live, according to Voegelin, in this constant tension between our limited, earthly, immanent reality and the pull of the divine, the transcendent. We're stretched between those two poles.
And faith, for Voegelin, isn't just a feeling about that.
No, not at all. He argues faith is an ontologically real event in history. It's a leap in being. It's when divine reality actually enters the human soul, and through that encounter, the soul participates in divine reality. It's real.
And he bases this on
critical analysis of the literary sources that describe these experiences. Plato's dialogues, Augustine's confessions, the story of Moses at the burning bush in Exodus. These are documents of that real event for him.
And this event, this leap, it brings order.
Yes, he argues it casts an ordering ray of objective truth over history. It's not just subjective.
And underpinning this is the idea that human nature itself is open.
Openness towards transcendence. That's fundamental for Voegelin. Science can't prove or disprove it. It's a reality you either recognize and can point to in the evidence of human experience, or you don't. And for Voegelin, the evidence is clear. It is reality.
So through this experience of being addressed by the transcendent, what do we actually learn? What's the revealed knowledge?
Voegelin outlines 4 key things. 1, you understand your mere humanity versus this transcendent being. 2, you experience this world-transcendent being as the highest reality, above all worldly things. 3, this being addresses you, so it must be personal God. And 4, you realize you can be addressed. You stand in this open relationship to God.
So the content of revelation is the fact that it happens.
In essence, yes. The fact of revelation is its content. That's a crucial formulation for Voegelin. The experience itself is the core message.
Okay, but then we try to put it into words, into doctrines.
And that's where the problem lies. Accepting the human formulation of that experience rests on faith, not knowledge. There's a fundamental difference between God's call itself and our human attempts to describe it.
And if those human formulations are seen as totally flawed,
you could end up in radical subjectivism, like Kierkegaard, maybe. A kind of desert where nothing objective holds.
But if they're not totally flawed,
then there must be criteria to distinguish legitimate formulations, ones that faithfully reflect the experience, from illegitimate, maybe heretical ones. And finding those criteria is a huge historical and philosophical challenge.
Okay, so Voegelin is focused on experience and formulation. Strauss, meanwhile, he's looking critically at modern theology's attempts to deal with all this, right? Especially reconciling faith and science.
Yeah, Strauss is very critical of how modern theology tries to make the Bible palatable by distinguishing, say, its inner meaning from its external historical or scientific claims.
How does that work, according to him?
Well, they might use a distinction like history versus nature. Faith needs historical facts. Okay, so there could be conflict with historical criticism. But faith doesn't make claims about nature, so there's no conflict possible with science. That's the move.
And the danger Strauss sees.
The danger is that faith assertions become purely inner meaning. Just an emotional truth or a moral truth, but not something true simply about reality itself. An experience is only different from a hallucination based on its, quote, intrinsic value, not on whether it corresponds to something real outside you.
And this leads interpreters to pick and choose.
Exactly. Strauss argues this hermeneutic leads interpreters to decide which biblical teachings are central, the ones amenable to this inner meaning, and which are peripheral, the embarrassing external claims about miracles or God acting in nature.
And they explain away the peripheral stuff.
Yeah, as primitive consciousness or mythical residue. Strauss says this uses criteria external to the Bible itself, criteria imported from modern thought. It violates how the biblical authors understood their own claims.
Because they thought it really happened.
Absolutely. For them, the question, did this really happen, wasn't secondary. It was crucial. Modern interpreters replace that with their own criteria of relevance or inner meaning.
So even if you accept modern biblical criticism that the Bible developed over time, not dictated at Sinai, Strauss says a core difficulty remains.
Yes. The text unequivocally speaks of God's agency in the world. God loves, God chooses, God punishes, God is the ruler of the world, especially nature. That's just undeniable in the text.
In science.
Science knows nothing of this. It cannot, from its own premises, believe in God as an active power or factor in events. Science can talk about the fact that Scripture speaks of God, but it can't speak of God as an agent.
So for science, the Bible story is just human history.
It's simply a human historical phenomenon, the history of a text that speaks about God. This creates a fundamental, maybe unbridgeable tension between the biblical worldview and the scientific one, according to Strauss.
Okay, so we've got these two very different approaches emerging. Strauss focusing on rigorous historical reading, authorial intent, wary of modern subjectivity, and the clash with science over divine agency.
Right. And Voegelin focused on recovering the original experience behind the text, emphasizing openness to transcendence as reality, but deeply concerned about the deformation of symbols and the problem of formulating revelation accurately.
They both critique modern ways of reading the Bible, but from really different angles. Strauss emphasizes philosophical rigor and the text's own claims. Voegelin emphasizes experiential reality and the danger of ideological distortion.
And these different starting points are going to massively shape how they see the Bible's legacy playing out in history, especially its relationship to order and disorder.
It really matters how you read the source.
Absolutely. It determines what you see. Micro recap.
All right, quick recap of Section 2. We delved into how Strauss approaches these texts, his focus on understanding the author's original intent, exactly as they understood it.
And how Nietzsche's challenge to tradition makes this urgent, forcing a return to origins, a kind of radical questioning, and his critique of the seemingly neutral science of cultures.
Then we contrasted that with Voegelin. His view that the canonical Torah might be a deformation of the original prophetic, pneumatic word, tied to his concept of egophanic deformation.
Right. And his focus on returning to the experience behind the symbols, navigating our existence in the metaxy, that in-between space where our nature is this fundamental openness to transcendence.
We covered Voegelin's idea that the fact of revelation is its content, but the human formulation is tricky, and Strauss's critique of modern theology reducing faith to inner meaning to avoid clashes with science.
While ignoring the Bible's own insistent claims about God's real agency in the world, something science just can't accommodate.
So yeah, fundamentally different ways of even approaching the text, asking different questions about meaning, intent, experience, and truth, setting the stage for very different conclusions about its impact. Okay, so now let's see where these different readings take them when they look at the Bible's actual historical impact, especially its potential to cause, well, trouble, disorder.
Right. And Eric Voegelin, even though he sees the Bible as a crucial source of order, pointing towards transcendence, Ranieri says he has this uneasy relationship with it.
Uneasy how?
Well, he's deeply worried that the very intensity of the biblical experience, while revealing transcendent order, can also fuel these socially disruptive ideological movements. Fantasies, really.
So his whole philosophy of order is partly a response to that danger.
Exactly. It's intended as a kind of therapy for societal disorder. He wants to remind people of the normative, transcendent sources of order found in experiences like those the Bible describes, hoping to reorient lives.
There's a tension.
A huge tension. It's between the perfection of the divine order revealed and the messy imperfection of the actual world. As human consciousness differentiates and recognizes divine transcendence more clearly, that gap can feel enormous, unbearable even.
And that leads to
Metastatic faith. That's Voegelin's key term here.
metastatic, like cancer spreading.
Kind of. It's this dangerous desire, this leap of faith, to try and realize divine perfection here on Earth, to forcibly transfigure the world, society, human nature itself into the kingdom of God.
And he sees that as a threat.
A profound threat to civilization. Whether it's explicitly religious movements trying to impose God's kingdom, or secularized versions like revolutionary ideologies promising utopia, Voegelin sees them stemming from this same dangerous impulse.
So the Bible is paradoxical for him. It contains the source of transcendent order that society needs.
Yes, the very experiences that can ground personal and civilizational order. He's drawn back to it for that.
But it also contains the seeds of this dangerous, potentially civilization-destroying metastatic disorder.
Exactly. It's a source of stark, powerful revelation and potentially protean sources of social disorder. It's deeply problematic for him.
So Vogelin's task becomes, how do you keep the good stuff, the formative therapeutic side, while protecting society from the disordering side?
That's the central challenge he faces. And Ranieri asks, crucially, can he even do that while doing justice to the Bible's actual integrity? Can you separate those elements cleanly?
And this makes his approach different from Strauss, right? Because Strauss is more skeptical about claims to experience anyway.
Right. Strauss can analyze the text historically, critique its ideas perhaps, but he doesn't feel the need to validate the experience itself. Voegelin, because he is trying to evoke the experience behind the text as therapy, can't just dismiss the disruptive consequences as delusion.
So Voegelin has to ask, what is it about the biblical experience itself that might lead to this disruption, this imbalance?
And he points to Israel's origin story, its leap in being, the fact that Israel was constituted as a people by God's direct action, by covenant, before it gradually acquired normal, mundane social structures.
That's backward, usually.
It's a unique reversal of ordinary social evolution, Voegelin says. Societies usually start with myths, rites, earthly foundations, and maybe advance towards transcendent religion. Israel, he argues, started at the wrong end with the direct experience of transcendence.
And that's both good and bad.
Good in that it fueled extraordinary symbolic creativity. Bad in that it created this inherent instability, this potential disconnect from mundane reality from the very beginning.
He contrasts this with Greece.
Yeah. Greek consciousness, he argues, arrived at an understanding of true order by first understanding disorder. Israelite consciousness, starting at Sinai with the revelation of true order, the dabar, the word, left the prophets struggling to understand the messy, unchanging structure of the world.
So for Voegelin, trying to change that messy reality, that's the problem.
Yes, the constitution of being, reality as it is, fundamentally cannot be changed by human fancies or will. Metastatic faith, the attempt to transform reality into something it isn't, is therefore not just misguided, it's a rebellion against the nature of things as ordained by God.
Wow. A rebellion against God of creation.
That's how seriously he takes it.
Yeah.
And he traces this metastatic element right back to the Mosaic foundation, the very idea of Israel as a theopolity, a kind of kingdom of God incarnate on earth. That idea itself contains the seed of the problem for him.
So he's pretty critical of the prophets then, their visions of a transformed future.
Very critical at times. He questions whether their visions of a transfigured future society even make sense. And controversially, Ranieri points out, Voegelin sometimes seems to literalize prophetic imagery.
Like what?
Like taking symbols of human arrogance, cedars of Lebanon, or warnings against injustice, daughters of Zion's finery, almost literally, suggesting the prophets lacked respect for creation's beauty or the simple joys of life.
Ranieri pushes back on that.
Strongly. He argues Voegelin is missing the prophet's real point about social justice, covenant fidelity, and using powerful poetic language, not literal descriptions. He suggests their speech being an octave too high might reflect profound intimacy with God, not detachment from reality.
Voegelin also thinks the prophets lacked the right vocabulary.
Yeah, he argues they didn't have the developed philosophical tools of, say, Plato and Aristotle for analyzing character, or the Heraclitean concepts of faith, hope, and love as movements of the soul. They were handicapped by their symbolic language, in his view.
And he contrasts this whole biblical stream with classical Greece, seeing the Greeks as managing the tension better.
Yes. Especially later in his thought, he sees Greek thinkers like Anaximander and especially Plato as being aware of being addressed by the transcendent, but crucially retaining balance between that truth and the demands of earthly life.
How did Plato achieve that balance, according to Voegelin?
Through his philosophical myths, Voegelin sees Plato using myth not just as stories, but as a way to moderate the intensity of revelation, to protect the balance of consciousness. Plato understood human finitude, the boundaries set by reality, and didn't succumb to the temptation to try and abolish the cosmos.
So Voegelin's view shifted over time.
It seems so. Initially, maybe revelation itself distinguished Israel. Later, he seems to see Greek philosophers as equally gifted by divine insight, but the crucial difference becomes Greece and philosophy offered a successful mediation of the tension between transcendence and immanence, while Israel, particularly the prophets, did not.
So Israel becomes less important for his philosophy of order.
References become rarer, often more critical in his later work. Isaiah confronting King Ahaz becomes a prime example of the dangers of prophetism, contrasted with Plato's balance, and he tends to render biblical experiences in Greek philosophical language.
Which Ranieri argues might reduce their distinctiveness, evacuate the specifically biblical aspects.
That's Ranieri's concern, yeah. That the equivalences Voegelin finds might disguise a philosophical reduction.
How did Voegelin see the difference between, say, Plato and the prophets on the human condition itself?
He contrasts them sharply. Plato famously said human affairs are hardly worth considering in earnest compared to the divine, though necessary to deal with. The prophets, conversely, saw no subject as worthy as the plight of man before God. God is preoccupied with humanity, with concrete history, not just timeless thought.
And Christianity, how did that fit in for Voegelin?
He saw Jesus' teachings, like the Sermon on the Mount, as powerfully disengaging faith from any particular civilizational order. This was effective, but also created a danger, losing understanding for the necessary structures of worldly political order.
So Christian leaders had to kind of push back.
Christian statesmen, from Paul to Augustine, had to struggle to reassert the importance of organized government, the demands of world immanent order. Prophets might say political success doesn't replace obedience. Christian thinkers had to argue faith doesn't replace government. They had to manage that tension.
Did Christianity add anything unique in Voegelin's view?
Yes, definitely. He believed it decisively enlarged the Platonic Aristotelian understanding. The Christian experience of mutuality in the relationship with God, God bending in grace towards the soul, amictia, friendship, and grace imposing a supernatural form on human nature, that was something new, beyond the classical range.
And he analyzed John's gospel through this lens of tension.
Yes, the tension of consciousness, the conflict between awareness of the divine reality beyond the cosmos, the beyond, and the divine reality experienced as the source or beginning of the cosmos, the beginning.
And Plato managed this balance.
Voegelin thinks Plato's philosopher's myth did. It acknowledged the beyond, but insisted on respecting the boundaries of the cosmos, the laws of mundane existence. Plato avoided the metastatic temptation to transfigure reality.
So when metastatic expectations do arise, where do they come from?
From anxiety, Voegelin suggests. When the conflict between the revealed truth of order and the actual disorder of the world becomes too intense, too traumatic, that anxiety transforms the mystery of the not yet into concrete metastatic expectations of imminent world-changing transformation.
And the philosopher's job is to resist this.
Yes. The philosopher must guard against these distortions of reality. Their task is to preserve the balance between the experience of lasting reality and these theophanic events, making the paradox of existence intelligible.
And crucially, revelation itself needs protection.
That's a striking conclusion Voegelin reaches. Because the core theophanic experience is experientially unstable, prone to distortion, revelation requires protection against revelation itself. And that protection comes from philosophical balance, accepting limits.
Okay, so Voegelin's concern is metastatic faith disrupting order, finding the Bible problematic in its intensity, favoring Greek philosophical balance as a necessary corrective.
Pretty much. It's a deep appreciation for the transcendent source, but also a profound fear of its potential earthly consequences if not properly mediated by philosophy. Micro recap.
All right, let's quickly recap Section 3 on Voegelin's complex relationship with the Bible. His core concern is order versus disorder.
Right. He sees the Bible as both therapeutic, pointing to transcendent order, but also deeply problematic, potentially fueling metastatic faith, that dangerous desire to impose divine perfection on earth.
We talked about his view of Israel's unique leap in being as a source of this potential imbalance, contrasting Israelite consciousness with Greek consciousness, which he felt achieved better balance.
And his critique of the prophets for potentially lacking respect for mundane reality and having a metastatic element inherent in their vision, viewing metastatic faith itself as a rebellion against the God-ordained constitution of being.
He contrasted this with Plato, whose philosophical myths Voegelin saw as successfully moderating revelation and maintaining balance between the beginning and the beyond in the tension of consciousness.
Yeah, and his later thought tended to emphasize Greek philosophy's success here, sometimes rendering biblical material in philosophical terms, which Ranieri questions.
We touched on his view of Christianity disengaging faith from worldly order, the subsequent struggle of Christian statesmen, but also Christianity's unique contribution of mutuality and grace.
And finally, that core idea. Metastatic expectations arise from anxiety, and the philosopher's task is to maintain balance, even concluding that revelation itself, being unstable, needs protection from itself through philosophical discipline.
So really intricate argument about the Bible being both essential and potentially dangerous, needing philosophical containment.
Exactly. A very ambiguous legacy in his view. End of section 3, mega recap and flashcard placeholder.
So to really nail down Voegelin's perspective here, he's grappling with the Bible as this powerful force. On one hand, it reveals the transcendent source of order, which is essential for a healthy society and individual life. That's the therapeutic side.
Right. The experience of being addressed by the divine, that openness to transcendence, it's the foundation of true order for him. People who take the spirit seriously are the best guarantee of a good society.
But on the other hand, the sheer intensity of that revelation, especially as expressed by the prophets and in the idea of a chosen people or kingdom of God on earth, carries this immense risk of metastatic faith.
Exactly. That urge to short-circuit history, to violently impose a perfect order now, ignoring the limits of reality, the constitution of being. He sees this as a major source of modern ideological turmoil, a deformation of the original revelatory experience.
He contrasts this sharply with what he sees in Greek philosophy, especially Plato. For Voegelin, the Greeks, through concepts like nous, intellect, and the use of philosophical myths, managed to maintain a crucial balance.
A balance between acknowledging the transcendent, the beyond, and respecting the structures and limitations of the existing cosmos, the beginning. Plato's myths moderate the intensity, except finitude.
So for Voegelin, the problem isn't revelation itself, but a certain kind of revelation, or rather a certain response to it, one that leads to imbalance and rebellion against reality.
Precisely. And his solution, or his approach, involves using philosophy, particularly the insights he draws from the Greeks, to understand and navigate this tension, to protect the balance of consciousness, even arguing that revelation needs this philosophical protection against its own potentially disruptive power.
Key terms to remember from Voegelin here would be philosophy of order, his main concern, metastatic faith, the dangerous desire to perfect the world now, the leap in being, Israel's unique starting point, the constitution of being, the fixed nature of reality, the tension of consciousness between the beginning and beyond, and the philosopher's myth, like Plato's, providing balance, leading to his postulate of balance as the philosopher's duty.
That covers the core of his complex and often critical engagement with the biblical legacy regarding order and disorder.
Okay, so Voegelin sees this metastatic phase as a dangerous potential within the biblical tradition. How does he see that playing out in the modern world? Does he connect it to modern ideologies?
Oh, absolutely. He argues that the prophetic conception of a radical change in the constitution of being, this idea of a new eon, that's fundamentally at the root of modern beliefs in societal perfection.
You mean things like belief in inevitable progress? Or revolutionary ideologies?
Exactly. Things like the idea of unending progress or even communist revolution aiming for a perfect classless society. For Voegelin, these seemingly opposing modern movements, progressives, revolutionaries are actually brothers under the skin.
How so?
He sees them as late secularized descendants of that same prophetic metastative faith in world transfiguration. They've just swapped the religious content for secular goals.
So it's crucial to understand the experience behind these modern beliefs.
Yes, the experience expressing itself in these seemingly secular ideologies and the circumstances that allow this metastatic impulse to rise with such strength in modernity.
And he links this to apocalyptic and Gnostic responses to disorder.
Right. Remember his idea that when the conflict between the revealed truth of order and the actual disorder of the world gets too intense, too traumatic, that anxiety can induce this transformation of mystery into metastatic expectations. You expect God or history to just fix everything now.
Okay.
And when that divine intervention doesn't happen, when the world isn't magically transfigured, he sees two main responses developing historically. One is apocalypticism doubling down on the expectation of imminent dramatic change.
And the other?
The Gnostic type. Gnosticism, for Voegelin, is a particular kind of response that arises when metastatic hope is frustrated.
How does Gnosticism work, in his view?
The Gnostic basically says, the problem isn't just the disorder in the world, the problem is the world itself. Creation, the beginning, was somehow flawed, a mistake, maybe the result of a fall or conflict in the divine realm itself.
Wow, so reality is fundamentally bad.
Yes, and salvation comes not through fixing this world, but through acquiring special knowledge, gnosis, that allows the enlightened soul to escape this flawed cosmos altogether. Gnostic action, based on this secret knowledge, aims to reverse the flawed beginning and bring about the true end.
And he sees this Gnostic pattern in modern ideologies, too.
Very much so. He sees modern revolutionary ideologies that want to completely remake humanity and society, viewing existing reality as fundamentally corrupt and needing total transformation, as exhibiting this Gnostic structure. They have the secret knowledge, the ideology, and believe they can forcibly bring about the end.
How does Christianity fit into this historical development for Voegelin? It started as a Jewish messianic movement.
Right. And that created a tension from the start. Early Christian communities, he says, oscillated between intense eschatological expectation, waiting for the imminent parousia, the second coming of Christ, to bring the kingdom in full, and understanding the church itself as the ongoing apocalypse, the unveiling of Christ in history.
But the parousia didn't happen, not in the way some expected.
Exactly. So the church gradually had to evolve. Its eschatology shifted more towards a transhistorical, supernatural perfection after death, rather than an imminent transformation of history. The specific essence of Christianity got somewhat separated from its historical origins in Jewish messianism.
But the expectation of an earthly kingdom didn't entirely disappear.
No. Especially when Christians faced persecution, that expectation could flare up again. And Voegelin points to the Book of Revelation, which was included in the canon despite some misgivings. He sees it as having fateful consequences because it contains this revolutionary announcement of the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ with his saints on earth.
So that kept the earthly transformation idea alive?
Yes, it provided fuel for later movements that wanted to bring about that reign through human action.
This leads to his concept of immanentization, right? Making the transcendent immanent, bringing it down to earth.
Precisely. This is a key critique Voegelin levels against modernity. He argues that the essential Christian tension between our created, limited being and the hope for divine transfiguration in death gets collapsed or dissolved.
Oh.
It gets flattened into an imminent historical process. The symbol of heaven, the transcendent goal, gets dissolved. And in its place, you get attempts to create a materialist paradise on earth, substituting worldly fulfillment for the mystery of the beatific vision.
So calls for realizing the kingdom of God now, in time, become reinterpretations.
Yes, they take the spiritual symbols and turn them into a political program for temporal realization. Voegelin critiques a Puritan preacher named Collier as an example of this.
What did Collier say?
Collier preached about God being manifest in the saints and that the kingdom of God is wherever God is manifest. Voegelin interprets this as Collier being an activist mystic, transforming a mystical symbol into a political program.
Voegelin accuses him of abolishing the tension between earthly imperfection and divine perfection.
Yes, bringing the transfiguration into the historical present, substituting a materialist paradise for the transcendent hope. It's similar to his critique of the prophet's alleged massive materialism.
Does Ranieri agree with Voegelin's reading of Collier?
No, Ranieri offers a counter-reading. He argues Voegelin downplays Collier's focus on God being the one who transforms humans. Collier isn't saying the saints' will is God's will, but that where God manifests, that's where the kingdom and the saints are. He sees Collier as more traditionally Pauline, emphasizing God's action in the saints, who find joy in God while still doing their earthly work.
So Voegelin might be reading Collier too much through his own anti-Gnostic lens.
That's Ranieri's suggestion, yeah.
But Voegelin's overall point is that modern movements kept the problematic part of the biblical legacy.
Exactly. He says modern movements throughout the traditional eschaton, the transcendent endpoint, but they preserved what he sees as Judaism and Christianity's most dubious element. That metastatic faith in a coming new eon, a perfect age achieved within history.
Is this outcome inevitable, in his view, after Christianity?
He seems to think it's hard to avoid. After Christianity's differentiation of consciousness, you can't really go back to earlier, more compact cosmological views. The only way forward is towards a more differentiated understanding of mankind's unity under the mystery of the eschaton.
But modern anti-Christian revolts block that.
Yes. By removing the transcendent eschaton but keeping the apocalyptic desire for transformation, you get what he calls a ghastly farce, the drive of apocalypse without the meaning provided by the true transcendent eschaton.
So Voegelin's view of the Bible's role in modernity is complex, both good and bad.
Deeply ambivalent, nuanced and perplexing, as Ranieri says. On one hand, he makes this forceful appeal to the classical and biblical tradition as therapy for modern disorders. The differentiated transcendent God of Israel, the openness of the individual soul in Christianity, these are tremendous sources of order. But he constantly warns that the balance of consciousness achieved within the biblical orbit is precarious, inherently unstable, and inclined towards deformation into Gnosticism or metastatic ideologies.
How does he try to resolve this, especially regarding the New Testament?
His strategy seems to be separating what he sees as the problematic eschatological features, the legacy inherited from Israel's potentially imbalanced leap in being, from what he considers the essential, world-transcending core of Christian experience, like that mutuality with God.
Does that separation really work, though? If the gospel transforms people, makes them resist ideology, act reasonably, how do you judge their actions in the world?
That's a huge question Ranieri raises. Voegelin acknowledges the role of biblical religion in shaping citizens, but individuals still have to act in the world based on their orientation to transcendence.
So how do you tell someone's actions spring from that essential Christianity or from deformed metastatic faith? How do you distinguish the spirit from the problematic praxis?
It's incredibly difficult. Ranieri notes that Voegelin seems to make judgments based on what he deems politically acceptable or possible. He can't know others' inner experiences directly, so he tends to infer a deformed consciousness from political actions he dislikes or sees as unrealistic.
So if someone pursues radical social change inspired by their faith, Voegelin might see it as metastatic, even if they see it as living out the gospel.
That seems to be the danger, yes. The problem of Isaiah's prophecy challenging the political status quo runs throughout Voegelin's work.
Now, Michael Walzer offers a different perspective on the Exodus legacy in politics, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He doesn't just see the danger.
Right. Walzer fully acknowledges that the Exodus story can be used to support the kind of intolerant perfectionist politics Voegelin fears. That danger is real.
Okay.
But Jacob Walzer argues that's an exaggeration, a distortion of the story itself. It ignores how much the Exodus narrative focuses on the Israelites' failings, their backsliding, their constant need for internal reform even after liberation. They are a covenanted people, bound by law and mutual obligation, not just free agents pursuing a utopia.
So the story has built-in checks and balances.
Walzer argues it has a strong sense of this worldly complexity. Exodus politics, for him, is about liberation into a life of human dignity, which requires hard, continuous work within historical time. It's not about escaping history.
He contrasts this with revolutionary Puritanism.
He contrasts the more cautious, moderate wing of Puritanism, represented by Cromwell saying, "We are thus far," with the more radical elements. He argues the Exodus history itself gives rise to a more cautious, moderate Exodus politics.
And this is different from political messianism.
Yes. Political messianism, which might also trace roots to Exodus imagery, is different. It desires to escape history altogether, sees opponents as agents of Satan, and is willing to use any means necessary to force the end. Walzer draws a clear line between this and the more grounded, historically engaged Exodus politics.
So Walzer sees a more positive, or at least more complex and less inherently dangerous political legacy from Exodus than Voegelin seems to allow.
Exactly. He sees a pattern for revolutionary change, yes, but one that includes self-criticism, covenant, and working within history, not just the metastatic urge to transcend it violently. Micro recap.
Okay, wrapping up section 4. We saw how Voegelin connects the prophetic, metastatic impulse within the Bible to modern ideologies of progress and revolution, seeing them as secularized descendants.
Right. We looked at his analysis of apocalyptic and especially Gnostic responses that arise when metastatic hope is frustrated. Gnosticism viewing creation itself as flawed and seeking escape through knowledge.
We trace his view of Christianity's historical evolution, the tension between eschatological hope and the church in history, and the fateful role of Revelation's millennium in keeping earthly transformation hopes alive.
Leading to his major critique of modernity, the immanentization of the eschaton, collapsing the transcendent into historical projects, substituting materialist paradise for spiritual hope, using the Collier example.
We noted Ranieri's counter-reading of Collier, suggesting Voegelin might overstate the case.
And Voegelin's ambivalent conclusion, modern movements kept the Bible's most dubious element, metastatic faith, while ditching the transcendent frame, leading to a ghastly farce. The Bible is both a therapeutic source of order and precarious source of disorder.
His attempt to solve this by separating the essential transcendent core from problematic eschatology raises questions about judging actions in the world, how to tell true spirit from metastatic praxis.
Finally, we contrasted Voegelin's fears with Michael Walzer's more nuanced view of the Exodus legacy. Walzer sees it supporting not just potentially dangerous perfectionism, but also a more moderate, self-critical, historically engaged pattern of Exodus politics, distinct from world-rejecting political missionism.
So a deep dive into how Voegelin sees the biblical legacy, particularly its dangerous potentials, shaping the modern world's ideological landscape.
And a hint that other readings, like Walzer's, find different potentials within the same source. End of Section 4, mega recap and flashcard placeholder.
So let's crystallize Voegelin's view on the Bible and modernity from this section. His core argument is that certain powerful, potentially dangerous ideas from the Bible, especially prophetic visions of a transformed world and eschatological hopes, didn't just disappear with secularization.
Right, they mutated, they became immanentized. The desire for a perfect kingdom, a new eon, gets pulled down from a transcendent hope into concrete political programs aiming for perfection within history.
And this fuels modern ideologies, both progressivism and revolutionary movements.
Yes, he sees them as secular heirs to this metastatic faith, this Gnostic impulse even. They inherit the structure of the desire for total transformation, even if they reject the original religious content. They want to forcibly change the constitution of being.
And this is deeply problematic for him because it ignores the limits of reality, leads to violence, and represents a deformation of the original balanced experience of transcendence.
Exactly. It's the ghastly farce, the apocalyptic drive without the transcendent meaning. He critiques figures like Collier for allegedly collapsing the necessary tension between imperfection and perfection.
But this view is challenged, right? Ranieri questions his reading of Collier, and Walzer offers a different take on the Exodus legacy.
Walzer argues the Exodus story itself contains resources for a more moderate, historically grounded politics. Exodus politics focused on liberation within history, covenant, self-criticism, not just the messianic urge to escape history entirely.
So the key issue is this immanentization, bringing transcendent hopes down into worldly political projects. Voegelin sees this as a dangerous inheritance from certain biblical strands, while others might see those strands differently or find counterbalancing elements within the tradition itself.
That's the crux of it, and it leaves open the difficult question. When people act politically based on religious or quasi-religious ideals, how do we discern between actions rooted in a balanced spiritual core versus those driven by potentially dangerous metastatic or Gnostic impulses? Voegelin struggles with that judgment.
Key terms here: metastatic expectations continuing into modernity, Gnosticism as a response to failed metastasis, viewing reality as flawed, immanentization as the core modern problem, collapsing transcendence into history, political messianism, negative forces the end, versus Walzer's Exodus politics, positive complex, works within history.
Understanding these terms is crucial for grasping Voegelin's critique of the Bible's legacy in the modern political landscape.
Okay, let's shift back to Leo Strauss. How does he see the Bible's legacy shaping modernity, particularly modern philosophy and politics? It's different from Voegelin's focus on metastasis, right?
Very different, yeah. Strauss argues that modern philosophy, paradoxically, starts from a new natural foundation that is actually the residue of the supernatural, specifically, the extremes found in the Bible.
What does he mean by extremes?
He means these extreme possibilities or claims discovered by the founders of religious and philosophical traditions. Think of radical selflessness or universal love, or the idea of transforming the world for the better. In modernity, these once supernatural or exceptional ideas become taken for granted, almost natural, self-evident starting points.
And these become the new foundation.
Yes. They serve as the foundation for reinterpreting or even negating both the original supernatural context and the classical understanding of what's natural or typical for human beings.
So it flicks the classical approach.
Exactly. Ancient and medieval thought tried to understand the extreme by starting from the typical, the natural mean. Modern thought, Strauss argues, tries to understand the typical by starting from these secularized extremes derived from revelation.
Can you give an example?
He talks about the virtue of charity. In classical thought, the focus is on virtues like courage or justice, their essence, how they're taught. Modernity, influenced by the biblical theological virtue of charity, takes this extreme, self-giving love and makes it into a kind of natural or philosophic virtue that becomes the standard.
And this has consequences.
Yeah, he suggests it can lead to a radical critique of natural virtues like courage, almost denying their value in favor of this universal compassion or desire to alleviate suffering.
And this connects to how the goal of philosophy changes in modernity.
Absolutely. For Strauss, the end or purpose of philosophy shifts dramatically. It's no longer primarily disinterested contemplation of eternal truths as it was for the classics.
What does it become?
It gets identified with an end pursuable by all human beings, the practical goal of the relief of man's estate, improving the human condition, making life better, longer, healthier, more comfortable. Philosophy becomes subservient to this universal, practical end.
And Strauss sees this as
Fundamentally democratic. It's a goal for everyone, not just the philosophic few. And he argues this shift, while presented perhaps as purely rational or modern, is plausibly seen as inspired by biblical charity.
even if secularized.
Yes. Classical philosophy might even be disparaged as pagan, sinful pride in comparison. Philosophy and science are no longer ends in themselves, but tools in service of human power, power over nature, power to improve life for the masses.
How does Strauss contrast this modern orientation with classical political philosophy, especially regarding communication? He talks about Socratic rhetoric.
Right. He draws a sharp contrast. Socratic rhetoric, as Strauss interprets it, had a dual purpose. It aimed to lead potential philosophers towards philosophy, a kind of careful training and liberation.
And the other purpose?
To prevent the unfit, the masses, from accessing truths that might be harmful or destabilizing if misunderstood. It was emphatically just, in Strauss's view, animated by social responsibility.
Because not all truths are safe for public consumption.
That's the premise. There's a fundamental disproportion between the philosopher's potentially radical quest for truth and the requirements of a stable society. Society relies on certain opinions, even myths, and might try to tyrannize thought. Socratic rhetoric was a way to navigate that, to protect both philosophy and society.
He contrasts this careful, maybe even deceptive rhetoric with biblical propaganda.
That's the term he sometimes uses, yeah. He sees the Bible's mode of address as more direct, more universalizing, less attuned to the specific capacities of the audience or the potential dangers of its message.
He gives an example from Xenophon about moderation.
Yes, Xenophon's dialogue between Hiero the tyrant and the poet Simonides. Strauss reads it as an example of classical moderation and social responsibility. They reveal the potential freedom from conventional morality, not through explicit immoral principles, but through strategic silence by simply failing to notice or state certain moral principles.
So they disregard morality by deed rather than attacking it by speech.
Exactly. It shows a deeper understanding of political things, Strauss argues. Xenophon and Simonides are more politic, more prudent than someone like Machiavelli, who openly attacks morality. They refuse to separate moderation, prudence, from wisdom, insight.
And Strauss sees a parallel between this classical mode and a biblical prophet.
Interestingly, yes, he draws a parallel between Socrates reproving the tyrant Critias, as told by Xenophon, and the prophet Nathan reproving King David.
How does the Socrates story go?
Socrates uses an analogy. A herdsman whose cattle decrease and go bad, yet doesn't admit he's a poor herdsman, is strange. Stranger still is a statesman whose citizens decrease and become worse, yet feels no shame. This was reported to Critias, a subtle but sharp rebuke.
So both classical philosophy and biblical prophecy can involve confronting power, but maybe in different styles. Socratic indirection versus prophetic directness.
Perhaps. Strauss certainly emphasizes the Socratic artfulness, and this ties into his critique of universalism. Classical political philosophy, he argues, inherently opposes the idea of a universal, homogeneous state.
Why?
because the natural form of society for the classics was the polis, the city-state closed, graspable particular. Every political society, Strauss argues, following the classics, rests on a particular fundamental opinion or myth that cannot simply be replaced by universal knowledge or reason. This makes all healthy societies necessarily particularist.
And this imposes duties on the philosopher.
Yes. Because a truly rational society isn't actually possible, the philosopher has a duty in their public speech and writing this art of writing to be careful to support the necessary myths of their particular society, while perhaps communicating differently to the few capable of philosophy.
Wow. So the philosopher's public role is to support the myth, even if they know it's not the full truth.
That's a striking reading Ranieri highlights. Strauss seems to be extolling Socratic rhetoric, which involves this careful management of truth for the sake of social order, over what he perceives as the more direct, universalizing propaganda of the Bible.
And he explicitly links the universal state to the Bible.
Yes. Ranieri quotes Strauss explicitly juxtaposing the classical vision to what he calls the ghastly descendant of the Bible, the universal and homogeneous state. He deeply fears this outcome.
So Strauss consistently downplays any universalizing tendencies within the Bible itself.
Very much so. For Strauss, the Bible primarily reflects one particular community, Israel, exalting its own particular ancestral divine code. It's about a heroic people obeying a majestic, inscrutable God, according to the law.
He dismisses interpretations that emphasize Jewish universalism.
Yes, he's critical of liberal interpretations that find classical universalism in Judaism, or argue for Jewish involvement in modern culture based on that. He tends to neglect or downplay the prophetic messianic strain in Judaism, precisely because he associates it with modern universalism and progressivism, which he distrusts.
This connects to his famous essay, Progress or Return, doesn't it?
Absolutely. He asks, does Jewish messianic hope indicate a higher regard for the future than the past? His answer is largely no. According to the most accepted traditional view, he argues, the Messiah is actually inferior to Moses. The messianic future will be a return to the past, the full practice of the Torah.
So for Strauss, Judaism is fundamentally about return, not progress.
Judaism is a concern with return. It is not a concern with progress. He even notes that return is easily expressed in Hebrew, while progress is not. He contrasts this with the modern idea of progress, which assumes a barbarous beginning overcome by human effort, whereas the biblical view, for Strauss, assumes a perfect beginning from which humankind declines.
But Michael Walzer, again, offers a counter-reading of Exodus here.
Yes. Walzer emphasizes that the movement from beginning to end in the Exodus story is key to its historical importance. The strength comes from the promised end, but that end is present from the beginning as aspiration, hope, promise.
And the end is different from the beginning.
Radically different, Walzer argues. God's promise generates this sense of possibility that the world doesn't have to be like oppressive Egypt. Without that sense of possibility, oppression is just inescapable fate.
The Torah itself defines the new society against the old.
Yes, the moral code is explained and defended against Egyptian cruelty. The new regime is defined by contrast. Walzer argues that the language of revolutionary politics, including religious messianism, was arguably first developed here in the Exodus narrative. Oppression takes on moral significance.
So, where Strauss sees the Bible, particularly Judaism, emphasizing return and particularity, Walzer sees in Exodus a powerful engine for historical change, possibility, and a universalizable language of liberation and revolutionary hope, even if it requires ongoing struggle within history.
Exactly. It highlights how Strauss's reading, perhaps driven by his critique of modernity and fear of universalism, might downplay significant strands within the biblical tradition itself that point towards transformation and a future different from the past. Micro recap.
Okay, let's recap Strauss's perspective on modernity and the Bible's legacy. He argues modern philosophy starts from secularized biblical extremes like charity, which become the new natural foundation.
Right. And this shifts philosophy's goal towards the universal democratic end of the relief of man's estate, potentially inspired by biblical charity, but disconnected from its original context and from classical contemplation.
He contrasts this unfavorably with classical Socratic rhetoric, the art of writing, which was socially responsible, managed truth carefully, and recognized the need for particular social myths.
He sees this classical approach as opposing the universal and homogeneous state, which he views critically as a ghastly descendant of the Bible.
This leads him to downplay universalizing or messianic tendencies within the Bible itself, particularly in Judaism, emphasizing instead the theme of return to the law and the particularity of Israel's covenant.
Yeah, framing Judaism as concerned with return, not progress, contrasting it with modern notions.
And we briefly revisited Walser's counterpoint, emphasizing the Exodus narrative as a powerful source for revolutionary hope, possibility, and historical movement towards a different future, not just a return.
So Strauss offers this complex, often critical view, seeing biblical influence behind aspects of modernity he dislikes, universalism, democratic philosophy, while preferring classical moderation and particularity and reading the Bible itself through that lens. End of Section 5 mega recap and flashcard placeholder.
So summarizing Strauss's take on the Bible's legacy in modernity, it's quite critical, isn't it? He sees modern philosophy and politics deeply, perhaps unconsciously, shaped by biblical ideas, but often in ways he finds problematic.
Definitely problematic from his perspective. He argues that core modern assumptions, like the goal of philosophy being the universal relief of man's estate, the democratic impulse are essentially secularized versions of biblical concepts like charity.
And he contrasts this with his ideal of classical philosophy, which aimed at contemplation for the few and used careful, socially responsible Socratic rhetoric, the art of writing, to manage truth in society.
Oh, wait. He sees the classical approach, rooted in the particularity of the city-state and acknowledging the need for foundational myths, as a necessary bulwark against the dangers of universalism.
And he explicitly links that danger, the universal and homogeneous state, back to the Bible's influence, seeing it as a ghastly descendant.
Which leads him to interpret the Bible itself, especially Judaism, in a way that emphasizes its particularity and the theme of return to the law, downplaying or critiquing the prophetic and messianic strains that point towards universalism or radical future transformation progress.
So while he engages deeply with the questions raised by the Bible, Jerusalem versus Athens, his reading is heavily filtered through his critique of modernity and his preference for classical political philosophy. He uses biblical ideas to frame his analysis, but often in a way that highlights perceived dangers or contrasts them unfavorably with the classics.
Yes, his focus isn't so much on unpacking the Bible's internal message on its own terms, but on understanding its complex, often challenging relationship with philosophy and its perceived role in shaping the modern predicament he critiques.
Key concepts for Strauss here. Modern philosophies end shifting to relief of man's estate, democratic, biblically inspired. Socratic rhetoric, art of writing, classical prudent manages truth, contrasted with biblical directness. Fear of the universal and homogeneous state, seen as biblical descendant. Emphasis on progress or return. Framing Judaism as about return. We also noted Walser's counter on Exodus as a revolutionary pattern within history.
That captures the essence of Strauss's complex and critical stance on the Bible's enduring, and for him, often problematic influence.
Finally, we arrive at René Girard. His perspective brings the issue of violence front and center and connects it directly to culture, religion, and the Bible in a really unique way. Where does he start?
Girard starts with a fundamental observation about human culture. It's built on making a distinction between sacred violence and profane violence.
Okay, what's it?
Profane violence is the chaotic, reciprocal violence that threatens to tear a community apart, feuds, revenge cycles. Sacred violence is the decisive, often ritualized violence like sacrifice, or founding violence that ends the profane chaos and establishes social order.
But is that distinction real? Or just something we impose?
Girard argues it's fundamentally arbitrary. There's no intrinsic difference. But making the distinction has incredibly beneficial social effects. Religion, historically, makes these benefits possible by bestowing sacred status on certain forms of socially tolerable violence, like scapegoating, as an alternative to the greater chaos of uncontrolled violence.
So social order depends on us believing in this difference between good, sacred, ordering violence and bad, profane, chaotic violence.
Yes. And Girard's achievement, Ranieri argues, is showing how many of our cultural distinctions, legal systems, myths, rituals, even philosophical ideas, can be traced back to these unacknowledged assumptions about legitimate versus illegitimate violence, often rooted in an original act of collective violence against a scapegoat.
Okay, so culture manages violence through this sacred-profane distinction, often involving scapegoating. What happens in modernity, according to Girard?
Modernity presents a paradox. Victimage, scapegoating, collective violence. It's still present, maybe even more widespread in some ways, but the traditional sacrificial means of controlling it are becoming less and less effective.
Why? What happens when the mechanism fails?
It loses its effectiveness, which paradoxically often leads to more victims. Girard uses the analogy of drugs needing increased doses. As ritual breaks down, as prohibitions weaken, we can no longer trust the distinction between good and bad violence. The scapegoat mechanism requires collective unanimity and belief in the victim's guilt to work smoothly. When that's challenged, it starts to sputter.
And this leads to the paradox.
Yes. Escalating violence plus increasing sympathy for victims. We see unparalleled destruction in the modern era, yet also this widening concern for victims, human rights discourse, etc. How can both exist simultaneously?
And Girard's answer is,
the reason for this paradox, the loss of scapegoating efficacy, the growing recognition of the victim's innocence, is the presence and influence of the biblical text in Western culture.
the Bible did this. How?
Because, Girard argues, the Bible, uniquely among world mythologies and religious texts when read fully, strongly sides with the victim. Yes, earlier strata might contain traces of collective violence, mythic patterns, but what's remarkable about the Bible, especially as it develops, is its gradual unveiling and rejection of the sacrificial mechanism that founds culture.
So the Bible exposes the lie at the heart of sacred violence.
Exactly. It subverts the order based on violence once its message gets into the cultural bloodstream.
He uses the Joseph story again here.
Yes. His brother's violent expulsion of him is a classic example of vengeful consensus, collective violence against a perceived troublemaker. But the biblical text refuses to endorse their perspective. It presents Joseph as an innocent scapegoat, a victim of their jealousy, which Girard sees as a biblical formulation of mimetic desire, wanting what your brother neighbor has, leading to rivalry.
How is that different from, say, Greek myth?
Contrast it with the Oedipus myth. Sophocles might evoke sympathy for Oedipus, but the myth itself ultimately confirms his guilt, even if unwitting. The story asks, is he guilty? And answers, yes. His expulsion is therefore justified within the myth's logic. The Bible, in Joseph's case, says, no, he was innocent, the perpetrators were wrong.
And the passion narratives in the Gospels are the ultimate example for Girard.
The absolute peak. But here's the great irony he points out. The passion narratives, which for him are the most radical rejection of scapegoating imaginable, have often been interpreted as approving scapegoating.
How? Because Jesus' death looks like a collective mob action, a sacrifice.
Precisely. Because the mechanism of scapegoating is so clearly depicted, the crowd, the false accusations, the innocent victim, people mistakenly assume the text endorses the mechanism.
But Girard says the opposite.
Yes. He argues the Gospels have to portray the mechanism accurately in order to expose it. They have to show it from the inside, through similarity. Otherwise, they couldn't discredit the mythologies and the illusions of the persecutors.
So Jesus' death is non-sacrificial.
A non-sacrificial death, Girard insists. Christ dies against sacrifice, revealing its true nature and origin. This revelation, once understood, makes the sacrificial system unworkable in the long run. It disrupts and ultimately ends sacrificial culture, though the process is long and contested.
But historical Christendom often missed this.
That's the unfortunate consequence, Girard argues. By misreading the Gospels sacrificially, Christendom often operated from the same violent scapegoating horizon as other cultures, sometimes even using the text to justify persecution.
But the non-sacrificial truth remained in the text.
Yes, continuing to disrupt sacrificial structures from within, slowly increasing our ability to hear the victim's voice, leading to the modern paradox.
Now, how does Girard view philosophy in relation to all this? Ranieri notes he wasn't really a philosopher himself.
No, but well-versed. He engages with philosophy, especially Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Plato, often quite critically. He sees Plato, for instance, as being fundamentally deceived by mimesis, by imitation.
How so?
Girard thinks Plato's famous hostility to mimesis, especially in art, comes from a deep, almost primitive terror of imitation's power to generate conflict and chaos. Plato senses the danger, but doesn't understand its root in acquisitive mimesis rivalry born from imitating desires. So he fears mimesis, but can't fully explain why.
And Plato's attempt to clean up Greek mythology.
A noble attempt, Girard concedes, trying to remove the violence and immorality attributed to the gods. But because Plato lacks the biblical insight into the actual victims, often hidden behind the mythological narratives.
He erases the clues.
Exactly. By making the gods purely good, neither criminals nor victims, Plato inadvertently erases the traces of the original victimization that the myths, however distortedly, might have preserved. The signs pointing to the gods perhaps being ancient scapegoats themselves get eliminated.
So the philosopher's myth purges the violence, but also the truth about its origin.
Yes. Plato is trying to protect society from the chaos resulting from the breakdown of the old sacrificial system by founding a new, rational, philosophical culture. Girard admires his greatness, but concludes he ultimately misses the goal.
Which is?
Revealing the victim mechanism, demystifying the representations of persecution. Right at the point where philosophy could have achieved this insight, Girard argues, it loses its nerve and becomes just another screen, another way of managing and concealing the violent sacred.
Philosophy as an accomplice to violence.
That's his provocative claim. If Girard is right, it's not surprising violence itself is rarely an explicit central theme in philosophy. Philosophers occasionally let their guard down, Nietzsche, Heraclitus, Heidegger revealing glimpses, but mostly the system conceals it.
He mentions Heraclitus.
Yeah. Heraclitus's famous fragment, strife, polemos, is the father and king of all, suggesting violence is generative. Girard sees the Greek tragedians and Israelite prophets as having partly decoded this violence. Plato, by expelling the poets, was perhaps apprehensive of these uncomfortable truths. Heraclitus saw something, but philosophy generally provided a rational screen protecting society from the disturbing secret of its violent origins.
So philosophy becomes the last, final refuge of the sacred, hiding the scapegoat.
That's Girard's interpretation. Even Heidegger's profound insights into being and concealment, Girard argues, don't fully grasp the scapegoating pattern. Heidegger might sense the violence in Heraclitus or Anaximander, but doesn't suspect he's ultimately talking about the scapegoat.
And Girard draws a sharp line between the Greek logos and the Christian logos.
Absolutely essential difference, their attitude toward violence. The Greek logos, even in its highest philosophical forms, ultimately remains tied to or complicit with the distinctions born from violence, like Heraclitus' strife, making some slaves, others free.
Whereas the Christian logos,
the Johannine logos, the word made flesh in the Gospels. For Girard, this represents a God who is love, who treats warring brothers equally, for whom the categories derived from violence simply do not exist. Love is utterly incompatible with violence and scapegoating.
but the world rejects this logos.
The world, meaning human culture founded on unaware scapegoating violence, cannot tolerate the gospel logos, so it rejects it by assimilating it to its own sacrificial consciousness, misreading the cross as a divine sacrifice, for example.
The human mind is compelled to misrecognize it.
Yes. We believe there's only one logos, Girard says, and it hardly matters if we call it Greek or Jewish-Christian. The same foundational violence keeps manifesting, whether through religion or later fragmented into philosophy, aesthetics, psychology. The expelled true logos becomes hard to find.
So Heidegger was right, in a sense, that Western thought remains Greek.
Girard agrees with that conclusion, implying Western thought has this built-in blind spot regarding the scapegoating violence it inherited, the very violence the Christian logos uniquely reveals, but is then re-obscured by this assimilation.
Okay, how does Girard's view on violence stack up against Strauss and Voegelin? He shares their concern about ideologues.
Yes, he's also critical of activist dreamers and ideological violence. But the huge difference lies in how they read the Bible and its effects, especially its revelation of scapegoating and its generation of sensitivity to victimization.
For Girard, once the biblical revelation enters the picture, there's no going back.
No turning back. Once that message about the innocent victim gets into the cultural bloodstream, it becomes impossible to fully revive the old sacrificial practices, because effective scapegoating requires unawareness, collective belief in the victim's guilt. The Bible spoils that.
So understanding violence, mimesis, scapegoating, it makes justifying violence harder.
Much harder. Not necessarily out of pure benevolence, Girard suggests, but because we become better at recognizing violence's contagious, self-perpetuating nature, we see through the justifications more easily.
So Girard would critique those who focus only on ideological violence.
Yes. He'd say we shouldn't be taken in by the reverse illusion, the idea that violence used for law and order is inherently good or non-problematic.
Because they feed each other.
Law and order and violent excess feed on each other, he argues. If they didn't, we'd likely be rid of both. They are part of the same cycle of violence that the Bible tries to expose.
Ranieri brings up the modern plea for progress here. The argument that the poor, sick, hungry can't afford philosophical detachment about limiting technology.
Right. Feuerbach's point. Compassion is before thought. This is a challenge to the classical view that Strauss might favor.
And Girard sees the biblical rehabilitation of victims as truly extraordinary, not just one group versus another.
Yes, that's key. It's not just siding with our group against their group. The Bible, uniquely, gathers the faithful around the rehabilitated victim, exposing the injustice of the collective violence itself. That flame of truth, once lit, can't be fully extinguished.
He contrasts this with Socrates' death.
Yeah. In the philosophical tradition around Socrates, true philosophy escapes the contagion of the crowd. Truth exists apart. But at Christ's death, the disciples are speechless, absorbed by the crowd's violence. The text focuses on the victim and the crowd's delusion.
And Walser's point about Exodus's self-criticism fits here too.
Yes, the unsparing honesty about the Israelites' own failings is a strength Girard would likely appreciate. Philosophy, however, from its birth onward, Girard argues, has struggled to recognize its own complicity in scapegoating.
Athens demanded Socrates' death, but philosophy claims clean hands.
Philosophy insists on its bloodless hands, which is possible only as long as the scapegoating mechanism remains unconscious. Plato expelling the poets, Girard argues, shows Plato believing they deserve their fate. Plato's rejection of tragic violence is itself a form of violent expulsion, revealing him as the poet's enemy brother, oblivious to their mimetic rivalry. Socrates' death and Plato's reaction become suspect.
And Girard makes this startling claim about science.
Yeah, that the scientific spirit wasn't first. It actually presupposes the shift away from blaming victims, magical causality of persecution, towards exploring natural, correctable causes.
How did that shift happen?
To get people to explore natural causes, you first have to turn them away from finding scapegoats. You have to show them that persecutors hate without cause, and that persecution doesn't actually solve problems.
And only the Gospels could do that.
Girard argues it required the extraordinary combination of intellectual, moral, and religious factors found in the Gospel texts to achieve this miracle on a mass scale, not just among a few exceptional Greeks.
So no more witch hunts is the reason science was invented, not the other way around.
That's his stunning claim. The scientific spirit, like market economies, is a byproduct of the profound cultural action of the Gospels, disrupting the cycle of accusation and violence.
Wow. What about violence in politics? He mentions Thucydides.
Yeah, referencing the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides describes the kinesis, the social sickness, the unstoppable momentum of the conflict. Once caught in it, statesmen can't easily extricate themselves or make purely moral decisions. They're bound by the necessities of the process. Personal escape might be possible, but not political escape.
And Voegelin also sees this necessity in politics, but justifies it differently.
Yes, Voegelin acknowledges the tragic necessities of political order, the violence inherent in maintaining it, perhaps more explicitly than Strauss. He finds validation for this in the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander. Voegelin interprets Anaximander's fragment about things paying penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice according to the assessment of time as expressing the fundamental truth of the process, the tragic reality of the human condition where justice itself is founded on retribution and cyclical violence.
And this truth must be accepted.
For Voegelin, yes. It's tragic, but you can't alter it. He praises Plato for recognizing this Anaximandrian truth and avoiding the alleged mistakes of the prophets who tried to deny or overcome it through metastatic faith. Plato ensures this hard truth retains its balancing effect.
So this has theological implications too.
Huge ones. The God of Sinai and Exodus, who transcends creation and judges it, gives way in this philosophical view to a divinity subject to a fateful cosmic process. The sacral quality of the social order itself becomes questionable if God truly transcends creation.
Because the biblical tradition de-divinizes the state.
Yes, the New Testament especially. This threatens compact political orders that rely on a sense of inherent sacrality, often symbolized by intercosmic gods. Voegelin sees this de-divinization by the biblical tradition as potentially harmful to social order.
So he wants to preserve the order's sacrality.
Yes. And if the old myths are gone, a new myth is needed, crafted by the philosopher, like Plato, for society. He approves of this kind of Platonic sacralization of order.
So Voegelin ends up enlisting philosophy to justify the violence of order.
Ranieri argues, yes, quite clearly in his treatment of Anaximander. Philosophy provides the rational discourse to accept the horrors of the political process, like Burckhardt wrestling with how historical advances come through misery and mass murder. Voegelin seems to accept the Anaximandrian truth despite the reality of victims. Violence might be evil, but necessary for order.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize these views, especially through Girard's lens. How does he see violence operating?
Girard sees violence operating through the enslavement of a pervasive lie. It imposes a falsified vision of reality. Scapegoating only works when the practitioners genuinely believe the victim is guilty. The verdict of the crowd seems justified.
So escaping violence requires
Moving away from violence in all its forms, including the violence that seems natural or legitimate, like retribution.
which connects back to the Sermon on the Mount.
Exactly. For Girard, it's not masochistic or idealistic. It's profoundly realistic about our human tendency towards mimetic retaliation. Turn the other cheek is a practical strategy to renounce that mimetic cycle. Understanding mimetism helps us see this.
So getting rid of violence requires understanding it correctly, not seeing it as just a parasite or an instinct.
Yes, it's an enslavement to a lie. To leave violence, you have to give up retribution, give up forms of conduct that seem completely natural and justified.
And commentators often miss this.
They imagine the Gospels preach a naive natural morality, that people are naturally good, or that the kingdom is just a utopian dream. They don't grasp the radical diagnosis of violence itself.
So from Girard's perspective, where do Strauss and Voegelin fit? Their focus on justifying certain kinds of violence for order.
It places them squarely within the sacrificial logic that Girard believes the Bible, especially the Gospels, works to expose and dismantle. Their embrace of a Platonic view that allows for necessary violence or stabilizing myths. It stands in contrast to Girard's reading of the Gospel, advocating renunciation of retribution, because violence itself is the lie.
Strauss's Jerusalem doesn't fully engage this scapegoating revelation.
It serves more as a foil for philosophy in his work, not a deep dive into the biblical text's own radical critique of violence as Girard sees it.
And Voegelin, despite seeking therapy for disorder, ultimately pulls back.
He recoils from the potentially disordering aspects of revelation, like the de-divinization of the state. He seeks philosophical ways, drawing on the Greeks to reestablish a sense of sacrality and order, even if that involves justifying state violence. He misses or overrides the radical biblical critique of violence itself, according to Girard's reading.
Because for Girard, the biblical rehabilitation of victims is extraordinary precisely because it stands against the sacrificial logic of the crowd, exposing the mechanism itself.
Yes. It's not just one group against another. Philosophy, in his view, missed this and became an accomplice, and science itself is ultimately a byproduct of the gospel, turning people away from blaming victims. It's a perspective that really does live up to the title, Disturbing Revelation. It challenges our understanding of culture, violence, religion, philosophy, and even science itself.
Wow, we've covered an incredible amount of ground here. We started with Ranieri setting the stage of the Bible as this undeniably formative foundational text for the West, whether we approach it religiously or not.
Its core narratives, its themes of redemption and community, its eschatological hope, its wariness of state power, its siding with the victim, all laying the groundwork.
And then we plunged into how these three intellectual giants, Strauss, Voegelin, and Girard, wrestled with that legacy. And their interpretations were profoundly different, often clashing.
Absolutely. We saw Strauss, the meticulous historian of thought, focused on authorial intent, critiquing modern philosophy's secularized biblical extremes and its democratic turn, fearing the universal state, and emphasizing classical prudence and return over progress.
We saw Voegelin deeply concerned with order versus disorder, valuing the Bible's transcendent insights but fearing its potential to fuel metastatic faith, looking to Greek philosophical balance as a necessary corrective, and critical of modern immanentization.
And then Girard, offering that radical rereading, seeing the Bible as uniquely unveiling the foundational scapegoating violence of human culture, arguing its message against sacrifice is the hidden engine behind modernity's paradox of victim sensitivity amidst violence, and viewing philosophy often as an accomplice in hiding this truth.
Their disagreements, they're not just academic footnotes, are they? They represent fundamentally different ways of understanding where Western thought comes from. The nature of social order, the relationship between philosophy and revelation, and the potential dangers and promises hidden within the biblical legacy itself.
Did the Bible bring order or disorder? Justify violence or expose it? Make us better or create new, perhaps more subtle dangers? These thinkers give starkly different answers.
It really shows how complex these texts and their influence are. It's not simple, not straightforward, it's contested, ambiguous, and as we've seen, it continues to shape debates today, even when we don't use the explicit language.
The echoes are definitely still there.
Which brings us, I think, to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe sit with. If the Bible, as Girard argues so forcefully, contains this truly disturbing revelation, if it exposes the foundational violence, the scapegoating that societies have so often been built on. And if that revelation itself, the word against sacrifice, is the deep, perhaps unacknowledged source of our modern sensitivity to victims, that strange paradoxical mix of unbelievable destruction and ever-widening compassion, what does that actually mean for us, for our own efforts to create order and justice in the world today?
Are we still caught in that fundamental tension Girard describes? Do we, maybe like Strauss or Voegelin might imply from the different viewpoints, still need to rely on some forms of necessary violence or prudent statecraft or carefully managed myths to maintain social order, even if we know it risks falling back into that sacrificial logic?
Or are we also hearing, perhaps more strongly than we realize, that radical biblical call Girard identifies? The call to side with the victim, to renounce retribution, to break the cycle of violence, even when that feels completely impractical, maybe even dangerous or suicidal in the world as it is.
How do you, knowing about this disturbing revelation, navigate that tension, that paradox of order, violence, justice, and victimhood in your own understanding of society, of history, of current events?
Something to definitely think about. It adds another layer, doesn't it, to how we see the world unfolding around us.
It certainly does. The conversation definitely continues.